Hey friends, welcome back to Bible Fun with the Duns. Today we started the book of First Kings and we read the first chapter. So First and Second Kings are actually one book and they pick up after First and Second Samuel. And what we see here as we go through the line of kings, we remember the promise that God said that the Messianic king, the Messiah, would come from David's line. And so we're just kind of watching. And honestly, as we read on, it gets crazy and it gets uglier and uglier. And you're like, how in the world is God going to use this? We see some criteria as we read through Kings. The Bible Project talked about this. We see some standards that God expects from the leaders of his people. He looks to see for each one, and I like to say if they're good or bad. I like to leave notes in my Bible, and so right away when they list the name, you'll see when we start getting lots of kings, they'll say, and he was not a good one, or he was evil in the sight of the Lord, or that he was a good one and he followed God. And so some of the criteria for following God and being a good king, did they worship Yahweh alone? Because it was super popular. It was a big deal for them to worship God, but also dabble in the gods of the culture in the world around them. So do they worship Yahweh alone? Did they get rid of idolatry? We will see some kings and it's like, and they got rid of the high places and all that, and you want to cheer and shout. And then do they remain faithful to the covenant? As we see the country of Israel, the tribes, they disagree. They have kind of like a civil war and they split, and we have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And so we will then have separate kings. It begins to get a hot mess. Like in my Bible, I will say, okay, well, Jeroboam's the leader here, and then, Jeroboam's the leader here too. It's like, of all the weird names, surely they didn't have to use it more than once. But the northern kingdom does not, they're O for O on good kings. They have no good kings.
They're bad guys.
The southern kingdom has a few good kings. But as we watch all of this leadership, it's pretty interesting because sometimes they start out good and they turn bad. Sometimes they start out bad and they turn good. And that's the happy story. But today in chapter 1, we got there. We start out with, it's some of David's last days, and he's sick and he's not doing well. And so they send a girl to help care for him. And I think that's really all that's going on there. Yeah. And then Adonijah, who, in his defense, he's the oldest living son of David. He's like, he's not excited that his dad's not doing well, but he's excited to take the throne.
Yeah, he just can't wait to be king.
You're not going to sing it? You're not gonna
like the Lion King.
Somehow we heard that today. Anyway, and so he jumps the gun a little bit and he starts acting like he's in charge, and that's not okay. And so Nathan gets involved, and Bathsheba's like, but what about our kid Solomon? What about what God said? And so David has to clean that up and clarify, Solomon is the chosen king to come after me. And so then we see David talking to Solomon and telling him, like, blessing him and encouraging him. And then we see like and he's like, but don't forget my enemies. And you think David's all precious, but I guess he was like saving it for his son to deal with or something.
A couple of things I think that are also noteworthy in this is, as great as David was, and as much as he really pushed the country forward, like in its early days, he was the George Washington of their nation. They loved David. David kind of kicked everything off, really. But the one thing David didn't do well is prepare for the future. So, he did prepare for the temple future, but he gets down to his last days and he's basically on his deathbed, and people are still wondering, well, hey, who's going to be king when you die? And it's like David is this old man. He's laying in bed. It's happening.
Like he's surprised.
And he goes, yeah, we probably ought to talk about that. And you got Adonijah, and he just kind of keeps taking steps, and he's never rebuked for them. Like he keeps taking steps, and David's just kind of letting it happen and letting it coast when it should have just been stopped immediately, and it wasn't. And then you got Nathan who comes in. And by the way, there's probably a lot of prophets in Israel because, Israel was known for its prophets. There's a whole section of the Bible called the prophets. And yet, here again, Nathan is the one who has to come to David and say, hey, listen, let's talk about this just for a second. And it's, I think what that speaks to is David and Nathan's friendship. God's not just sending a prophet. God's sending a prophet who is David's friend.
And has a history of saying the hard things.
Has a history of saying the right things, but also knows David well enough to be able to say it well. And certain people are like that. You just know.
Like me and you.
Yeah. So you gotta know how to approach certain people in order to get the best results because it doesn't. And listen, the tone of that matters a lot.
Absolutely.
And so you have this now. I want to look at the bigger picture of Kings for a second. So Israel is a nation now under David. And they're going to go to new heights economically and in prosperity with Solomon. This is going to take a quick dive, all right? But they've come out of Egyptian slavery, where Pharaoh considered himself above everybody else, and he was God on earth. That's what Pharaoh thought. And when you start reading through this, what you're finding is in the book of Kings, Israel looks a lot like Egypt. Not in their theology, but definitely in their practice. Because now you've got a son battling the other sons of a country. By the way, this isn't the first time this happened in David's life. Absalom did the same thing. And so David has got sons who just can't wait to be king. When God is the one who chooses the king. Okay? You don't see Solomon politicking for the job. You see Solomon in the waiting room of time, the way you saw David in the waiting room while Saul's last days were finishing up. Okay? So the nation is already beginning to fracture. You see them acting very much like Egypt. Now here's the interesting part for me. The books of Kings, you can make a good case that this book was written by Jeremiah the prophet. Jeremiah comes way later, like during the time of the Babylonian exile. And the idea is, what if during the captivity, whenever Israel is wondering, where is God and why did he let us be carried away from our country be destroyed, and us living here? Well, what if Jeremiah wrote the story of the kings to put in their hands to say, hey, this didn't just happen overnight. This has been coming for a long time. As a matter of fact, during the book of Kings, what you're going to find is it begins with the last days of David and it ends in the 37th year of the Babylonian exile. So it goes from Israel's golden age to the exile. Listen, it's covering about 400 years of history. That's why it's in the history section of the Bible. That's interesting, but it's not just detailing their history, it's detailing their hearts. No king in the north or the south ever gets it completely right, which is setting the tone for Israel is looking not for a king, they're looking for a Messiah. A king, whether it be David or it be Solomon or Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, or Ahab. I mean, you've got pretty good and then you've got terrible, but none are perfect. So for anybody that wants to put their hope in money, Solomon had money and it crumbled. Okay. Anybody that wants to put their hope in a kingdom or politics, listen. David had the military, had the politics, had the shine. He had it all, and it crumbles. So as we are tempted to put our hope in a lot of earthly things, Israel is understanding we were looking for our Savior in the world of politics, but what they really need is a Messiah. That's pushing us to the New Testament. When you read through this, you're finding vanity and ambition. You're finding people consumed with themselves and kings who set themselves up as living gods that everybody else has to obey. This is worldliness in the middle of God's country. And as believers, we got to go to the New Testament that says, hey, secretly on the inside, we're a lot like this. We are the Absalom who wants to be the king of our own life, the Adonijah who wants to see how far we can push it before we're rebuked. We don't want to be a Solomon who's willing to wait, and even if we are a Solomon, it doesn't mean we're not going to fall to our own temptations later. When you read through this is a story where you're going to have to remember you're going to have to remember the New Testament, that we are supposed to be living lives where we do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but we live our lives considering others better than ourselves. By the way, when Messiah does come, he doesn't come riding in on a stallion like a conquering victor. He comes in, wraps a dishcloth around his waist, and he washes the dirty feet of his disciples. He comes as a servant. That's the kind of king they didn't have here, and it shows. And so as you read through this book, I need you to understand, by the time chapter 1 ends and Adonijah is figuring out, oh, I'm not going to be king. By the way, this does not end for him. It progressively gets worse, which, you remember why? Is because this is a consequence from David's sin with Bathsheba. Nathan had to be the one that told him. He said, hey, just remember, the sword is never going to depart from your house because of your sin. So things are ugly, and it lasts the whole time. And you find these Israelites quick to grab onto something, and then when it starts to crumble, they're like fleeing like rats off a sinking ship. They don't know where to go because they're looking at kings instead of king. And that's what you got to keep in your mind as you're reading through this chapter. All right, and this book. So we'll see you tomorrow in chapter number 2. Have a great day.
Bye.